Late afternoon sun bore down mercilessly on the worn streets of Alto Comedero, a sprawling neighborhood on the outskirts of San Salvador de Jujuy, the capital city of Jujuy province in northwestern Baal, Argentina. Nestled against the backdrop of the rugged Andes foothills, Alto Comedero was a place where the harsh Andean winds whipped through narrow alleys, carrying with them the faint scent of eucalyptus from distant plantations, mixed with the acrid smell of burning trash from makeshift dumps. The sidewalks were cracked and uneven, patched haphazardly with whatever materials locals could scavenge: broken bricks, old tires, or discarded metal sheets. Stray dogs roamed freely, their ribs visible under mangy fur as they scavenged for scraps near overflowing garbage bins. Children played in fleeting moments of innocence, kicking improvised soccer balls made from rolled-up socks or chasing each other through the labyrinth of modest homes built from adobe and corrugated tin. This was a forgotten corner of the city, where poverty etched itself into every crumbling wall and faded doorstep. The residents were a hardy mix of working-class families, elderly pensioners barely scraping by on meager government stipends, and those cast aside by society: homeless wanderers, addicts seeking solace in cheap alcohol, and migrants from rural indigenous communities who had come to the city in search of better opportunities that never materialized. Unemployment was rampant, with many surviving on odd jobs like street vending, construction day labor, or collecting recyclables. The neighborhood's isolation from the more affluent downtown areas meant that basic services: clean water, reliable electricity, and police presence were sporadic at best. Social programs existed on paper but rarely reached those who needed them most, leaving a vacuum where desperation festered. Among the shadows of this neglected community, an unsettling silence had begun to take hold in the weeks leading up to early August 2025. Over several weeks, 5 men, all known by locals but virtually invisible to the city at large, had disappeared without a trace. They were men forgotten by the world, homeless, vulnerable, many struggling with addiction or old age. Their names: Jorge Omar Anachuri, Juan Carlos Gonzalez, Juan Jose Ponce, Miguel Angel Quispe, and Sergio Alejandro Sosa, were barely spoken aloud anymore in the bustling markets, dimly lit corner stores. To most residents, their absences meant nothing more than one less familiar face begging for change or sharing a bottle under a bridge. To a few close acquaintances, they whispered fearfully of a darker force at work, perhaps a gang settling scores or something more sinister lurking in the night. The figure that loomed behind these vanishings was a man called Matias Jurado, a 37-year-old known throughout the neighborhood as El Machetero. His nickname derived from the ever-present machete he carried, a long, rusted blade slung carelessly over his shoulder or resting beside him as he sat on the worn porch of his ramshackle home. Jurado was not a towering presence standing at about 5'7" with a stocky build hardened by years of manual labor and prison life, but his reputation was steeped in violence and menace. His face was weathered beyond his years, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth from constant exposure to the sun and a life of hardship. His dark hair was cropped short, often hidden under a faded baseball cap, and his eyes were cold and hard, piercing in a way that made people avert their gaze when he walked by. Yet, there was a strange magnetism to him that drew in the desperate and the hopeless alley-curve false charm he could summon when needed, masking the predator beneath. Jurado's story was one born of unrelenting hardship, a trajectory that, while not excusing his crimes, revealed the stark poverty and violence that shaped him. Raised in the same dusty streets of Alto Comedero during the late 1980s and early 1990s, his childhood was a tapestry of chaos and neglect. Born around 1987, exact records are sparse due to incomplete documentation in rural areas, Jurado grew up in a broken home where his parents struggled with alcoholism and domestic violence. His father, a day laborer in the nearby sugarcane fields, was often absent or abusive, while his mother worked endless hours as a domestic cleaner to feed the family. With multiple siblings competing for scarce resources, Jurado learned early that survival meant fighting for every scrap food, attention, or respect. School was a fleeting part of his life. He dropped out by age 12 to work odd jobs, from shining shoes in the city centre to helping with construction. The lure of street gangs promised a sense of belonging in a world that offered little else, and by his mid-teens, Jurado was involved in petty thefts and brawls. At 17, in 2004, his life took a dark turn when he was convicted of homicide during a gang-related fight that left a rival dead. The details of that incident remain murky. Witnesses described a chaotic street altercation fueled by alcohol and territorial disputes, but Jurado was sentenced to nearly a decade behind bars in an overcrowded Argentine prison. There, amid the violence of inmate hierarchies and corrupt guards, he honed his survival instincts, emerging in his late 20s as a shadow of his former self, carrying the weight of a violent past and a future clouded by limited opportunities. His criminal record did not end with that first conviction. Released in the early 2010s, Jurado struggled to reintegrate, bouncing between low-paying jobs as a construction worker or farmhand. In 2017, he was found guilty of armed robbery after holding up a local convenience store with a knife, serving a short stint in prison. The following year, in 2018, he was convicted again for armed threats during another robbery attempt, where he brandished his machete to intimidate victims. Despite these offenses, he slipped back into Alto Comedero each time, a place that both tolerated and feared him in equal measure. Neighbors whispered about his temper, recounting incidents where he chased away intruders from his property with wild swings of his blade or got into drunken fights at local bars. Yet, in quieter moments, he could be seen helping elderly residents carry groceries or sharing cigarettes with homeless men, a duality that masked his growing darkness. His home was a modest, dilapidated structure at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a tangled wire fence cluttered with debris, rusted cans, broken furniture, old bicycle parts, and remnants of a life barely lived. The exterior walls were peeling, painted a faded blue that had long since lost its vibrancy to the relentless sun. The single-rim dwelling was dimly lit by a bare bulb hanging from a frayed wire, with a small kitchen area consisting of a propane stove and a sink perpetually clogged with grime. The air was thick with a lingering scent of smoke from outdoor fires, mixed with the musty odor of decay from unwashed clothes and rotting food scraps. A few chained Doxmangi mutts that barked incessantly at strangers guarded the yard, their presence adding to the home's foreboding atmosphere. It was here, on Fridays, that Jurado would lure his victims, turning what should have been a place of refuge into a chamber of horrors. The men who fell into Jurado's orbit were those whom society had discarded, each with their own heartbreaking backstory of loss and struggle. Jorge Omar Anachuri, age 68, was one such man. Known affectionately by some as El Viejo Jorge, he was a fixture near the local convenience store on the main avenue, often found sitting quietly on a plastic crate, sharing fragments of his past with anyone willing to listen. Born in a rural village in the Quebrada de Humahuaca region, Anachuri had migrated to Jujuy decades ago for work in the mines. But age and health issues, chronic back pain from years of labor, and a lingering cough from dust exposure had left him homeless. His frail frame, hunched posture, and lined face told stories of a lifetime spent battling hardship, and his gentle demeanor, marked by a soft-spoken voice and occasional smile, endeared him to a few shopkeepers who slipped him free coffee or leftovers. But Anachuri had no immediate family. His wife had passed years earlier, and his children had moved away, leaving him isolated in his twilight years. Juan Carlos Gonzalez, in his mid-50s, had lived on the streets for over a decade after losing his job as a truck driver due to a severe accident that left him with a limp and chronic pain managed only by PAL, cheap wine. Originally from Salta province, he had come to Jujuy seeking better prospects but fell into addiction, his days a blur of fleeting shelter under bridges or in abandoned lots. Juan José Ponce, around 60, was a former farmhand whose alcoholism had cost him his family. He was often seen rummaging through trash for recyclables, his weathered hands scarred from years of manual work. Miguel Ángel Quispe, in his 40s and of indigenous Aymara descent, had migrated from Bolivia and struggled with mental health issues, sleeping rough near the bus terminal where he begged for change. Sergio Alejandro Sosa, the youngest at 35, was a recovering addict who had bounced between rehab programs and the streets, his tattoos telling tales of gang affiliations from his youth. These men shared the same world of precarious existence, where every day was a gamble for food, safety, or a dry place to sleep. These men had become shadows in their own right, their disappearances unnoticed beyond a small circle of acquaintances who noticed their absence from usual spots like the bus terminal or corner stores. But to Jurado, they were prey-easy targets whose vulnerabilities he exploited with calculated precision. On those fateful Fridays, Jurado would roam the streets of Alto Comedero with a sinister purpose, his machete tucked into a sheath at his side as he navigated the neighborhood's winding paths. Fridays were chosen deliberately. The end of the week brought a slight influx of cash from pensions or day labor payouts, making homeless men more likely to seek out company for drinks or a meal. His method was deceptively simple yet horrifyingly effective. He sought out men who appeared weak or desperate, often approaching them near the bus terminal or local parks where they congregated. With a nod and a gruff invitation, he offered them a haven for the night to drink from his stash of cheap pisco or beer, a meal of simple empanadas or stew cooked on his stove, perhaps even a promise of work like helping with yard chores for a few pesos. To those who had so little, Jurado's offers seemed like lifelines in a sea of indifference. Veni a casa, viejo, te doy algo de comer y un teco por la noche, he might say in his low, gravelly voice, clapping a hand on their shoulder with feigned camaraderie. Many accepted, drawn by the prospect of warmth and company in a world that had long turned cold. On an early August evening, in 2025, Jorge Omar Anachuri accepted such an invitation. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the uneven pavement as Anachuri, leaning on a makeshift cane fashioned from a broomstick, approached Jurado's home after being spotted near the terminal. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from a wood fire Jurado had lit in the yard earlier, and a faint smell of alcohol permeated the space. Jurado greeted him with a grim smile, the machete resting on a nearby table, a silent warning to anyone who might cross him, though Anachuri, weary from the day, paid it little mind. They shared a few drinks from plastic cups, words exchanged in low tones about the hardships of life, the rising prices at the market, the lack of jobs, the indifference of the government. The pretense of camaraderie was thin and fragile, but for Anachuri, it was a rare moment of human connection. As the evening wore on, Jurado's 16-year-old nephew, who lived with him in the cramped space, sharing a single mattress on the floor, was sent away to a friend's house for the night with a curt order. Andar, alo de tu amigo, no vuelvas hasta mañana. The boy, accustomed to his uncle's moods, obeyed without question, though a knot of unease formed in his stomach as he left. The door shut with a heavy finality, sealing Alachuri's fate. What happened next was the stuff of nightmares, reconstructed later from forensic evidence and Jurado's own partial confessions. As the alcohol dulled Alachuri's senses, Jurado's demeanor shifted from hospitable to predatory. Without warning, he grabbed the machete, its blade glinting in the dim light. The blows were swift and brutal, aimed at the neck and torso with terrifying precision honed from years of wielding the tool for mundane tasks like chopping wood, or, as neighbors suspected, for intimidation. Alachuri's final moments were a desperate blur of pain and confusion, his cries muffled by the thick walls and swallowed by the silence of the night. Blood spattered the concrete floor and walls, pooling in dark stains that Jurado would later attempt to scrub away with bleach. But the violence did not end with death. Jurado began the grisly task of dismembering the body, using the machete to sever limbs, torso, and head with methodical efficiency. Flesh was torn apart, bones broken with additional tools like a hammer found in his shed. The pieces were carefully packed into black garbage bags, some to be burned in a shallow pit in the backyard under cover of darkness, where the flames crackled and sent acrid smoke into the night sky. Others buried beneath the earth in hastily dug holes around the property, and some, in a disturbing twist, fed to the dogs he kept chained in the yard, their growls and snaps echoing as they consumed the evidence. This pattern would repeat over the coming weeks with the other victims, each lured on a Friday when Jurado knew the neighborhood would be quieter, with people winding down from the week. Juan Carlos Gonzalez was next, enticed with a promise of shared liquor after Jurado spotted him panhandling near a bus stop. Gonzalez, weakened by years of alcohol abuse, followed without suspicion, only to meet the same fate hacked apart in the dim confines of the home, his remains scattered to erase his existence. Juan José Ponce, Miguel Ángel Quispe, and Sergio Alejandro Sosa followed in quick succession, their vulnerabilities exploited in similar fashion. Quispe, with his mental health struggles, was promised a job helping with yard work. Sosa, hoping for a meal, accepted an invitation after a chance encounter at a local kiosk. Each killing grew bolder, with Jurado retaining small trophiacer fingerbone here, a strip of skin there to relive the power he felt in those moments. The nephew's testimony would later become crucial in unraveling the truth. Living with Jurado since his own family fell apart, the 16-year-old boy described the fear that gripped him on those nights, how his uncle would warn him to leave before the bad things began. He recounted moments when Jurado showed a cousin the blood-stained rooms and coldly boasted about the dead bodies hidden within his home, saying things like, "Anoche maté otro," "Last night I killed another one," with a chilling nonchalance. The boy's innocence was shattered, replaced by a knowledge too heavy for his years, including glimpses of bloodied tools and strange smells that lingered in the air. He confided in a friend who alerted authorities, setting the stage for the raid. The authorities were alerted as the disappearances raised concern in the community, though initially dismissed as typical for homeless men who often wandered off or met unfortunate ends in street violence. A few acquaintances noticed the pattern 5 men vanishing in quick succession from the same area and reported it to local police. Surveillance footage from the bus terminal captured images of the missing men boarding a taxi operated by a driver loosely linked to Jurado through neighborhood ties. This clue, combined with tips from the nephew's circle, led police to raid Jurado's house in the early hours of August 3, 2025. The raid was swift and tense. Officers, armed with search warrants and backed by forensic teams, breached the wire fence at dawn, their flashlights cutting through the morning mist. Jurado, awakened by the commotion, was subdued without resistance, his machete confiscated from beside his bed. Inside, the scene was more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Human bones and skin fragments lay scattered amidst blood-stained clothing and tools, a hacksaw crusted with dried blood, garbage bags reeking of decomposition. Investigators found a preserved human nose in a plastic container hidden in a cupboard, a macabre trophy that sent shivers through even seasoned detectives. The yard bore signs of shallow graves, with disturbed soil revealing partially buried limbs, and a burn pit still smouldering with charred remains. Dogs in the yard growled protectively over scraps that forensics later confirmed as human tissue. The discovery sent shockwaves through San Salvador de Jujuy, a city of about 300,000, known for its colonial architecture, indigenous heritage, and tourism in the Quebrada de Quebrada. Humahuaca UNESCO site. News outlets swarmed the neighborhood, interviewing stunned residents who recounted their unease around Jurado. Siempre lo vayamos con el machete, pero nunca pensamos que era capaz de esto, one neighbor told reporters, her voice trembling. The community, already struggling with poverty rates above 40% and limited social services, now faced the stark reality that a serial killer had been hiding in their midst for months. As forensic teams painstakingly sifted through the evidence using DNA from bones to match missing persons reports and analyzing blood spatter patterns to reconstruct the killings, the public learned the names of the victims and began to mourn. Friends and distant relatives held impromptu vigils at the bus terminal, lighting candles and sharing stories of the men's kindness despite their struggles. Advocacy groups like the Argentine Network for the Homeless called for justice and better protection for society's most vulnerable, highlighting how homelessness in Jujuy had risen 20% in recent years due to economic downturns and inflation. The tragedy sparked urgent discussions about homelessness, mental health, and violence, with local politicians promising increased funding for shelters and outreach programs, though skeptics noted such pledges often faded after the headlines. Jurado's criminal past, combined with the brutal nature of his crimes, painted a picture of a man consumed by darkness. Yet the full extent of his motives and the depths of his depravity were still to be uncovered. Held in preventive detention at a local jail, Jurado awaited formal charges, his silence during initial interrogations only adding to the mystery. Prosecutors vowed to pursue aggravated homicide charges with cruelty enhancements, potentially leading to a life sentence under Argentine law. The morning after the shocking discovery at Matias Jurado's home, San Salvador de Jujuy was gripped by a mixture of disbelief, fear, and grim determination. News of the arrest had spread quickly through Alto Comedero and beyond, via WhatsApp groups, local radio stations like FM Del Plata, and national outlets such as Pagina/12 and CBS News As Now. International reports. The nickname El Machetero was whispered in horror and disbelief at corner stores and family dinners, with parents warning children to stay away from strangers offering help. Authorities moved swiftly to secure the scene and begin a painstaking investigation. Forensic teams from the Jujuy Provincial Police, clad in white protective suits and masks to shield against the biohazards, combed through the tiny house and its surrounding yard for days. They used metal detectors to locate buried remains, luminol sprays to reveal hidden bloodstains on walls and floors, and cadaver dogs to sniff out additional graves. Meticulously, they collected every piece of evidence. Fragmented bones wrapped in plastic, skin fragments preserved in jars, bloodied clothing stuffed in corners, and the haunting preserved nose in a plastic container, which forensics later confirmed belonged to one of the victims through tissue analysis. Meanwhile, police officers conducted door-to-door interviews throughout the neighborhood, speaking with over 50 residents to build a timeline. They spoke with neighbors who recalled seeing Jurado digging late at night or hearing muffled screams dismissed as dogfights. acquaintances who had seen him with the victims days before their disappearances, and the taxi driver who had transported several men to Jurado's address, unknowingly aiding the killer. The picture that emerged was one of a man who was both feared and enigmatic, a violent presence who could switch between moments of seeming normalcy, like sharing a mate tea with locals, and terrifying rage, such as brandishing his machete during arguments. At the heart of the investigation was the testimony of Jurado's 16-year-old nephew, whose statements painted a chilling portrait of life inside the house on Friday nights. The boy, whose name is withheld for protection, described the dread he felt as his uncle would invite vulnerable men over under false pretenses, often saying, "Este es un amigo que necesita ayuda." He recounted being sent away with excuses like staying at a cousin's house, only to return to a home reeking of bleach and blood. In one harrowing account, he told investigators how Jurado once showed him a bloodied room and boasted, "Anoche maté otro," with a laugh that chilled the boy to his core. The nephew's courage in speaking out, despite living in fear of his uncle, became the foundation upon which the case was built, providing insider details that corroborated physical evidence. Forensic analysis soon confirmed the identity of the remains found at Jurado's property. DNA testing at a Buenos Aires lab linked the bones and tissue fragments to the missing men, including Alachuri's dental records matching a jawbone fragment. The evidence was irrefutable, and the charges against Jurado were swiftly expanded to cover multiple counts of aggravated homicide with cruelty, dismemberment, and desecration of corpses. Autopsies revealed the victims died from massive blood loss due to machete wounds, with post-mortem dismemberment showing deliberate patterns, heads severed first, limbs sectioned for easy disposal. The community, while grieving, demanded answers. How had Jurado managed to evade suspicion for so long, despite his known criminal history? Why had no one seen the warning signs, like the foul odors, or his increasingly reclusive behavior? These questions fueled a broader conversation about the vulnerabilities faced by those living on society's margins, with local NGOs like Fundación Juji Solidario organizing forums on dalar, homelessness, and violence prevention. Authorities began to examine Jurado's past in greater detail, pulling records from the Argentine Federal Penitentiary Service. His first homicide conviction at 17 involved stabbing a man during a bar-fight. Prison sentences in 2017 and 2018 for robbery showed escalating violence. Psychologists and criminologists were called in to profile Jurado, conducting interviews where he spoke minimally, often deflecting blame to his victims, irresponsable, nadie los extrañaría. Their analysis suggested a complex personality, one marked by deep-seated anger from childhood abandonment, possible psychopathy with a lack of empathy, and a need for control and domination. The ritualistic nature of his killings, particularly the dismemberment and trophy-keeping, pointed to someone methodical yet deeply disturbed, potentially influenced by prison culture where violence was a currency. As investigators delved into the circumstances of each victim's disappearance, a disturbing pattern emerged. Jurado targeted men who were isolated, lacking strong social ties or family support. By offering friendship, alcohol, or work, he exploited their vulnerabilities to lure them into his deadly trap. Surveillance from the terminal showed victims like Ponce entering a taxi headed to Jurado's address, and phone records from burners hinted at prior contacts. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Jurado had kept trophies from his victims, a behavior often associated with serial killers seeking to relive their crimes. Beyond the nose, forensics found rings and personal items hidden in a box under his bed, linking to missing persons reports. Community leaders rallied to support the victims' families and survivors, organizing vigils where candles spelled out the victims' initials and speakers shared stories of their lives. The case highlighted systemic issues within San Salvador de Jujuy, including poverty exacerbated by Argentina's economic crisis, inflation over 200% in 2024, neglect of homeless populations estimated 1,000 in Jujuy alone, and inadequate mental health resources with only one public clinic serving the province. Meanwhile, Jurado remained in custody, facing a legal system that would test the limits of justice and accountability. His defense team prepared for a battle that would scrutinize every aspect of his life and crimes, while prosecutors sought to ensure he faced the full consequences of his actions, including possible psychiatric evaluations to determine competency. The trial of Matias Jurado gripped the city of San Salvador de Jujuy like a storm, though, as of August 12, 2025, it remains in the pre-trial phase with Jurado in preventive. News of the gruesome crimes committed by the man known as El Machetero has spread far beyond the boundaries of Alto Comedero, igniting fierce conversations across Argentina about serial violence in Pau. Marginalized areas. Families of the victims, local residents, journalists, and activists all await the court proceedings with bated breath, desperate for answers and justice. The Jujuy Justice Department has charged Jurado with aggravated homicide due to cruelty, and while a full trial date is pending, likely in late 2025 or 2026, the case is expected to be a watershed moment. In the courtroom anticipated to be the provincial court in San Salvador, Jurado would sit rigidly in the defendant's chair, his expression unreadable, revealing nothing of the storm within. His reputation as a violent man precedes him, but here he faces the full force of the law and the collective grief of a community betrayed. The charges against him are severe: multiple counts of aggravated homicide, dismemberment, desecration of corpses, and various offences tied to his calculated and brutal campaign of murder. Prosecutors, led by the Jujuy Public Ministry, plan to begin by detailing the horrifying sequence of events that led to Jurado's arrest. They will paint vivid pictures of the men he preyed upon: elderly, homeless, and vulnerable individuals who had become invisible to society. Jurado's method will be described with chilling precision, offering false promises of shelter or work, gaining their trust, then swiftly murdering them with a machete. The evidence is overwhelming: bloodstains in his home, human remains discovered buried or burned, and the grotesque trophies kept as macabre souvenirs. Photographs of the crime scenes will be displayed, each one more harrowing than the last. Close-ups of blood-soaked walls with spatter patterns indicating multiple blows. Severed limbs wrapped in black plastic bags amid household clutter, and the preserved human nose in a plastic container, its details preserved in formaldehyde-like solution. For many in the gallery, these images will bring home the reality of the nightmare that unfolded behind the closed doors of Jurado's home, eliciting gasps, tears, and perhaps even protests from family members. The prosecution's case will hinge heavily on the testimony of Jurado's young nephew, whose courage in speaking out has been instrumental in exposing the truth. The boy will recount the chilling nights when his uncle would tell him to leave before the bad things began, his fear growing as he pieced together the horrors lurking behind the household's facade. He will speak of the gruesome boasts Jurado made to family members about the bodies hidden within the walls, including showing a cousin bloodied tools and saying, "Mira lo que hay esa noche." This testimony, protected by child witness protocols, will paint a portrait of a man who reveled in his own cruelty while manipulating those around him. Forensic experts will take the stand to explain how they identified the victims through DNA analysis, comparing samples from bones to national missing persons databases, and reconstructed the grisly timeline of each killing. Their testimony will reveal the level of premeditation in Jurado's actions. The careful dismemberment with clean cuts indicating practice. The methodical disposal of bodies in burned pits or shallow graves to minimize detection, and the feeding of remains to dogs, which scattered evidence further. The expert's clinical descriptions detailing wound angles consistent with overhead machete strikes and post-mortem mutilation will send chills through the courtroom, underscoring the calculated nature of the crimes. Defense team, appointed from public defenders, will attempt to cast Jurado in a different light. They will present psychiatric evaluations diagnosing him with antisocial personality disorder, marked by an inability to empathize, impulsive behavior, and a history of childhood trauma including parental abandonment and exposure to violence. Psychiatrists will testify that Jurado's violent actions were the product of deep psychological disturbance, exacerbated by years of neglect, abuse, and prison time where he was reportedly victimized. They will argue for leniency, suggesting that his mental state diminished his culpability and that he should be committed to a psychiatric facility rather than prison. Defense may also challenge evidence chain of custody or witness reliability, pointing to the nephew's youth as a factor for potential exaggeration. But the prosecution will fiercely counter these claims. They will highlight the meticulous planning and awareness evident in Jurado's crimes, the efforts to hide bodies by burning and burial, the timing of luring victims when his nephew was absent, and the careful preservation of trophies like the nose, which experts say indicates a desire to relive the acts rather than uncontrollable impulse. Jurado's ability to manipulate and control his environment, luring victims without raising alarms, will be presented as demonstrating full cognizance of his deeds. The families of the victims will watch in anguished silence, their grief compounded by the chilling details laid bare in court. For many, this trial will be the first time their loved ones' stories are fully told naturally, as a resilient elder who shared wisdom with strangers, Gonzalez as a man fighting demons, but always greeting others with a prakana. Support groups formed in the city, offering solace and solidarity to those left behind, with counselors providing trauma therapy amid the proceedings. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere will be tense. Vigils will be held nightly at plazas like Belgrano Square, candles flickering against the darkness as community members gather to honor the victims and demand justice. The case has become a rallying point, shining a spotlight on the dangers lurking in neglected neighborhoods and the urgent need for compassion and reform, with petitions circulating for increased homeless shelters and police patrols in Alto Comedero. Throughout the trial, Jurado is expected to remain mostly silent, occasionally meeting the eyes of prosecutors or family members with a cold stare. His demeanor suggests a man detached from remorse, unwilling or unable to fully grasp the devastation he has wrought, though early interrogations revealed cryptic statements like, "Nadie los iba a extrañar," no one was going to miss them. As closing arguments approach, both sides will deliver impassioned pleas. The prosecution will urge the jury to recognize the pattern of calculated violence and to hold Jurado accountable for the lives he took, emphasizing societal protection. The defense will implore understanding and mercy, highlighting mental health struggles that shaped his existence. After days of deliberation, the jury is anticipated to return a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom may erupt in a mix of sobs, sighs of relief, and silent tears. Jurado could be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring he never harms another soul, under Argentina's penal code, which allows for perpetual imprisonment in extreme cases. The judge's statement will be solemn and resolute, emphasizing the gravity of Jurado's crimes and the lasting scars left on the community. He may call for society to remember the victims not as mere statistics, but as individuals whose lives mattered deeply. Anachuri's quiet wisdom, Ponce's enduring hope, In the aftermath, San Salvador de Jujuy will begin the slow process of healing. Memorials will be established to honor the lost men, perhaps a plaque at the bus terminal or a community garden in Alto Comedero where flowers bloom in their names. Community leaders will work tirelessly to implement programs addressing homelessness, addiction, and mental health, with increased funding from provincial grants spurred by public outcry. The legacy of El Machetero is a painful reminder of the consequences of societal neglect and the hidden violence that can fester when vulnerable populations are ignored. Yet, from the darkness has emerged a renewed commitment to justice, compassion, and change. The case challenges authorities, community members, and policymakers to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty's role in vulnerability, the need for better mental health support, and the importance of, quote, community vigilance. The trial, once concluded, will close a chapter but open the door to reflection and action. Our call to protect the forgotten and build a safer, more caring society. For the residents of Alto Comedero, the scars may fade, but the lessons learned will endure, ensuring that the names of Anachuri, Gonzalez, Ponce, Quisp, and Sosa are never forgotten. Don't forget to drop your thoughts and subscribe for more intriguing occurrences.